When I was in high school, my parents moved us from the States down to South America for a couple of years. My dad was a full-time missionary in our church, and he got assigned to help a small remote village in Bolivia. When I say remote, I mean remote. This place was pretty off-grid, with only a couple hundred people living in the area. There wasn't much, but there was a very old church that was on the outskirts of what one might call the main town area. This church is where we spent most of our time. This story is not my own, but was told to us by one of the local clergymen that we befriended and became quite close with during our time in the area. He had grown up in the village and told us of a young family that lived there in the late 80s, early 90s. The young couple had a daughter who was around 4 or 5 years old, and they were new to town, but quickly became very active members of the congregation, so everyone got to know them in no time and they fit in well. Their daughter started talking about her friend who she would play with at church. This started happening after a few months of her family being there, and she would only talk to her friend when she was in the church. The congregation is small, and there was not another girl close to her age, so the family didn't pay much attention to their daughter's new imaginary friend and just figured she was going through a stage which isn't abnormal for kids her age. This went on for months, and eventually the daughter would start to disappear. The family would search frantically and eventually always find her sitting alone in the dark basement of the church. When they would ask what she was doing, she would always say her friend wanted to show her something down there. More concerned for the daughter's safety and not wanting her to go down, scrambling in the dark getting hurt, they put a padlock on the door, and this put a stop to that. Eventually, the girl asked her parents if her friend could come home with them. Not thinking much of it, the parents said sure and laughed it off. Remember, the town is very small, so the family lived not far from the church and would usually walk from home. It was only about a 5-minute walk. At home, they would hear their daughter playing and talking like she had a friend in her bedroom. They would ask her questions about her friend like how old she was, what does she talk about, which oddly enough, when they got to this question, the daughter wouldn't ever answer. They would move on and ask what the friend looked like, and she described her as a girl her age, having yellow hair, blue eyes, and light white skin. This was strange to the parents because their family, which were native Bolivians, had only ever lived in remote areas of Bolivia, never had a TV, and it would have been impossible for their daughter to ever have any exposure to a white girl with blonde hair. This really confused the parents. Why would she make that up, and how? This went on for a while until one night the father gets up to check on the girl and she isn't in her bed. He frantically looked all over the house and she is nowhere. The wife wakes up and panics now as well. The husband rushes to the church to find the phone numbers of a couple men from the congregation to see if they can help search for the daughter. When he arrives at the church, the front door is locked. He fumbles with his keys and opens the heavy wooden door. As he rushes to his office, he passes the basement door and notices the padlock is unlocked and flipped to the side. He cautiously opens the door and looks down, but the basement is pitch black. He's just about to close the door and lock it, but then he hears his daughter's voice from the basement. It sounds like she's arguing with someone. He yells down to her, flips on the lights, and runs down to find her in the middle of the floor, sitting Indian style, facing away from the stairs. He grabs her, infuriated and relieved at the same time. Once they got home, they talked to her and asked her what she was doing and how she even got into the church. She said her friend wanted to show her something in the basement and took her there. She said her friend let her into the basement and she doesn't want to be friends with her anymore. The dad asked if that's why she was arguing with the friend when he found her, and she said yes. Her friend has been trying to get her to hurt her mom. The friend had told her the family was going to move away, and she needed to take a knife from the kitchen and stab her mommy when she was sleeping so they could always be friends. Her parents were terrified. They were actually planning on moving back to their hometown, but never said anything to their daughter. Needless to say, they ended up expediting the move, and the church was blessed from any evil. This family wasn't aware at the time, but our friend who told us the story and had grown up in this village knew the history. He told us the most alarming part of the story when they told it to him was when she described her friend. The town had in fact been founded by, and the church has been built by, Nazi Germans who escaped to Bolivia after World War II, white with blonde hair and blue eyes. Ashamed of the history, the town has scrapped any evidence, such as photos, and none of the descendants of the original founders were still around. Until then, my family had been the only white people to live in the town, or even visit for that matter. I was never one to believe in ghosts or spirits. That is until I moved into apartment 210. You see, in 2013, me and my wife split. I got split custody with my children. I had to find a local place with 2 bedrooms that was big enough for when I had my kids. No, nothing happened here at first, and my kids and I really made it our home. But then after a couple months, it begins. One night, I am in my room and it's 2:30 in the morning. I hear my kids banging toys around and giggling in their room, and I hear their TV come on. Irritated, I call out, "You guys are supposed to be asleep. Don't make me ground you." The banging and giggling stop, but I hear the TV going, and I get up and walk to their shut door, still half asleep, and say, "Okay kiddos, I told you to go back to..." As I begin opening their door, it occurs to me that my kids are at their mom's. I had taken them back to her the evening before. A chill runs down my body as I slowly push the door open to see toys strewn all over and a cartoon playing on the TV. I turn the light on, unplug the TV, then bolt to the living room, shutting their door behind me. I turn all the lights on in the apartment and sit on edge all night. Nothing else like this happens, but the next week, while my kids were there, I'd catch my 3-year-old daughter Alexis talking to somebody when my 6-year-old son wasn't around. So I asked her who she talked to, and she replied, "My friend old mom. Her kids got burned up, so she is nice to me because I look like her little girl." My daughter said this word for word, and usually she couldn't talk that plain. I immediately call her mom and ask her what she's been watching over there, but her mom says just her cartoons. I once again got chills down my entire body. My son never saw what Alexis saw. Over the next few months, my little girl continues to talk to and about old mom, sometimes even pointing behind me, telling me old mom is there watching me to make sure I'm a good daddy. Very creepy. Over the past few years, my little girl has gotten to like spooky stuff and is fascinated with scary shows and movies. But at this time, she was only 3 and had never seen scary stuff, so I was really getting concerned and had a hard time sleeping. Then one night, I was reading a kid's book called The Monster in My Closet to my kids. They were lying in bed when I was sitting in a chair next to her bed. At the end of the book is a page that says for the kids reading it to draw the monster in their closet. This gave me an idea. I told my daughter to draw old mom for me. She sits up. I give her a pencil and the book, and she says, "Can you move, Daddy? She's behind you and I can't see her." I scoot away a little, and my little girl looks in the direction where I sat before, then looks down, draws a little, looks up again, then draws some more, and continues to do this until she finishes. She hands me the picture. I look at it and begin to tremble. That weekend, we moved to an apartment in the next town over. Some might say it was her imagination, and she just made up the drawing, but she was 3, and I believe if she made it up, she wouldn't have taken her eyes off the paper as she drew, but she kept looking up as she drew, and that tells me she was looking at old mom while drawing her. You would know why I moved after seeing this drawing.
I wouldn't necessarily call this a possession, but as a child there was something evil coercing me to think badly. I remember fighting with all my might to not act upon those thoughts. I was about 5 years old. My little sister and I always had imaginary friends. I had my 4 and she had her 4. One day I found a 5th one, and unlike the others which were in my head, this new friend was the one I would always speak to as if it was a real person. My mom would be cooking in the kitchen while I'd be in the living room, talking to whatever was there. I've never talked to my imaginary friends like that before. The conversation always seemed serious and like an actual topic when my mother would overhear me speaking. My mother was confused. "Who are you talking to?" she'd ask. "Bodoy," I'd respond. My mother thought it was a strange name, but never thought anything of it. I have a good memory. I can remember most of my childhood like it was yesterday. I recall the moment his presence became more extreme. He'd tell me to hurt my sister. He'd tell me to hurt my mom. I'd always scream at him in response. I never wanted to hurt anyone. This is when things take a turn for the worse. My sister and I were having a tea party in my room with our imaginary friends. I was the only one who could see Bodoy. He was a little boy, your average-looking 10-year-old kid. "He's not real," my sister yelled. In order for her to believe me, I needed proof. "Bodoy, open the closet," I said, looking straight at my sister. I was angry that she didn't believe me. But I wasn't as angry as he was, and that frightened me. My closet door opened, and my sister screamed. I remember my parents running in, and my whole vision went black as I passed out. After that, Bodoy wasn't so nice to me. Instead of appearing as a 10-year-old boy, he began to appear in the form of a black shadow with red glowing eyes and sharp white teeth. He'd stand at my closet all night. I'd scream every time he'd show his teeth. My parents would run in, and I'd say, "Bodoy is scaring me with his teeth." My mother never knew what to do about it. They told me to tell him to go away, though this became an every night occurrence. I'd scream, they'd run in, tell me to tell him to go away. It was a very exhausting situation. Now that I'm grown, my mom told me this. She woke up in the middle of the night to my father screaming, "Jesus." He was quite religious. My mother was confused but was too tired to ask. She rolled over and saw a black shadow standing in their bathroom. Once they had woken, my father told her exactly this. I had woken up to a little boy running back and forth in front of the bed, screaming curse words trying to make me angry. I screamed Jesus to make it go away. So, they put the pieces together and made the connection that this must be Bodoy and that I was actually being terrorized by something evil. They reached out and found help through the church, who in turn performed a religious exorcism type cleansing to the house and me. I never convulsed or anything like an actual possession. I was cooperative and I repeated all the words the preacher wanted me to. To this day, I haven't seen Bodoy since the day of the exorcism, but I sometimes get paranoid that I will see him again.
This happened many years ago when my family moved into an old farmhouse. I was about 3 at the time. The house was so old that the walls were hand-split boards covered by newspapers and layers of wallpaper and paint. My mother believed in the supernatural, but my father was a skeptic and made fun of any belief in the paranormal, so my mother never really talked about those kind of things when I was growing up. So here I am now, many years later, having been brought up to be skeptical about anything paranormal, but knowing there are a lot of things that I can't explain from that house. One of the many is my lady in black. As a 3-year-old, shortly after we moved into the old house, I suddenly developed an imaginary friend. I'd never had an imaginary friend before, but my mom just accepted this as a passing phase children go through. Unlike most children, however, my friend was apparently an elderly woman in a long black, high-necked dress, white hair in a high bun, with a rather distinctive white horse brooch around her neck. I always referred to her as my lady in black. Nothing much there, I suppose. A lot of children have imaginary friends. Here's where it gets a little weird though. When I was about 4, my mother was frantically looking for me in the house one day. I was ill and supposed to stay in bed. She couldn't find me inside anywhere. She even started checking under the beds and in the wardrobes. She was about to leave the house to look for me when she looked out the kitchen window, and there, I was in the yard with my father, filling the water trough. About 30 minutes later, I came in. Apparently, I stopped at the door of the kitchen, cocked my head to the side, and looked up, as if I was looking at someone tall standing beside me, and then looked at my mother and asked her why she was looking in the wardrobes for me when I was with my father. I then looked up again and then back to my mom and said, "I'm sorry I scared you." My mom asked how I knew she was looking for me, and I told her, "The lady in black told me you were worried," and then named all the places she had looked for me and said, "But then you looked out the kitchen window and saw me with Dad." My mom had no way of explaining this, and it really freaked her out. I also remember telling my mom that the lady in black came to say goodnight to me and tucked me in every night. I found out years later that my sister would get visits too. As I got older, I stopped talking about the lady in black openly because my father didn't like it, but I still would acknowledge her presence to my mother, who was much more open about these things. When I was about 8, my father started renovating the inside of the house and removing the old hand-split boards off the walls. My mother told me later that while removing the walls, an old photograph fell out, and it was a picture of an elderly woman, white hair and a high bun, dressed in a long, high-necked black gown, and at her neck was a white brooch. Exactly how I described my imaginary friend in the years before. My description never changed, and I'd even draw pictures of her. My skeptic father passed it off as a coincidence, but since I'd always mentioned a white horse brooch, he got out a magnifying glass to look closer at what was around the woman's neck in the photo. He then tossed the photo and the magnifying glass down, swore, and left the house. My mother then looked at the photo with the magnifying glass. Closer examination showed it was a white horse facing the exact way I had described it. When my father left for his afternoon shift, my mother got out all her old family photos, some from the same era, and mixed the photo from the wall in among them. She laid them all out on the kitchen table before I came home from school. I came home, saw the photos on the table, and immediately picked up the picture of the woman and asked what her name was, because this was my lady in black. I remember that because I was so excited to see this picture and finally found out who she was. My lady in black didn't come around as much after that. I don't know if I got too old, or maybe opening the wall and finding the photo released her in some way.